The community center buzzed with unusual energy for a monthly HOA meeting. Word had spread about the confrontation between Diane and the new assistant commissioner, drawing 3 times the normal attendance. Diane surveyed the room from her position at the head table, noting unfamiliar faces mixed among the regulars. "Before we begin," Diane announced, "I'd like to introduce our newest resident, Ms. Melissa Chen, who has graciously agreed to speak about accessibility in planned communities." The introduction cost Diane physically, each word tasting bitter, but the board had insisted on this olive branch as part of their settlement agreement. Melissa Chen approached the podium, elegant in a tailored suit, her manner confident but not confrontational. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I appreciate the opportunity to address my new neighbors." For the next 15 minutes, Melissa delivered a presentation on how inclusive design benefited entire communities, not just those with disabilities. She shared statistics on aging populations, explained how accommodations often increased property values rather than decreasing them, and outlined simple modifications that made neighborhoods more livable for everyone. Diane watched, increasingly unsettled, as heads nodded in agreement around the room. This wasn't the vindictive government bureaucrat she'd expected. Melissa was knowledgeable, reasonable, and worst of all, likable. When Melissa finished, the questions from residents weren't hostile but curious and engaged. Mr. Patel asked about modifying pathways in the community garden to accommodate his wife's walker. The Johnsons inquired about resources for adapting their home for their aging mother. Even Richard Wilson, who had complained endlessly about the eyesore of a mobility scooter parked on his neighbor's porch, seemed genuinely interested in alternative storage solutions Melissa suggested. "One final note," Melissa said as she concluded. "My department is launching a new recognition program for HOAs that demonstrate excellence in inclusive practices. The first recipients will be announced next quarter, with grants available for community improvement projects." The applause that followed was enthusiastic, and Diane felt something shift in the room, and unexpectedly, within herself. She remembered her own mother's struggles with steps after her hip replacement, how they'd modified Diane's childhood home with makeshift solutions because they couldn't afford better. When had she become so focused on appearances that she'd forgotten about people? After the meeting, Diane approached Melissa in the parking lot. "Your presentation was informative," she admitted stiffly. Melissa nodded. "Thank you for allowing me to share it. The permanent ramp design you submitted, it's actually quite in keeping with the architectural standards." "Yes, we worked with an architect who specializes in universal design. Beauty and function can coexist, Mrs. Holloway." Diane hesitated, then asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the confrontation. "Why didn't you tell me who you were when I came to your door? You could have shut down the violation immediately." Melissa's expression softened slightly. "Because it shouldn't matter who I am. Every family deserves the same consideration, regardless of their connections or position." The simplicity of the answer caught Diane off guard. For the first time in years, she was questioning whether her approach to leadership had been entirely wrong. 3 days after her confrontation with the Chen family, Diane called an emergency HOA board meeting in her meticulously decorated living room. 5 board members sat uncomfortably on her floral sofa as she paced the Persian rug. "This is completely blown out of proportion," Diane insisted. "Yes, I may have been a bit firm about the ramp, but I was simply following our guidelines." Ted Wilson, the vice president of the HOA and a retired attorney, cleared his throat. "Diane, I've reviewed the letter from the Department of Housing. This is serious. They're questioning every accommodation request we've handled in the past 5 years." "And how many is that?" asked Margaret, the board treasurer. Ted looked prim. 27 were submitted. We denied 23. A heavy silence fell over the room. "Were any of those denials legitimate?" Margaret finally asked. "Some, perhaps," Ted admitted. "But I've spent the last 2 days reviewing our records. Many of them should have been approved under ADA guidelines." Diane stopped pacing. "So we made a few mistakes. We're volunteers, not legal experts." "That's not how the law sees it," Ted countered. When we took these positions, we accepted responsibility to understand the relevant regulations. What exactly is Ms. Chen asking for? Asked Robert, the newest board member. Ted consulted his notes. First, immediate approval of the temporary ramp. Second, expedited review of the permanent ramp design. Third, a formal review of our accommodation policies with oversight from her department. And fourth, what? Diane demanded when he hesitated. Diversity and sensitivity training for all board members. Diane's face flushed crimson. Absolutely not. I will not sit through some political correctness seminar because one family can't follow the rules everyone else manages to follow. Margaret leaned forward. Diane, we should consider. No. Diane slammed her hand on the coffee table, rattling the untouched tea service. We stand our ground. If we cave on this, next thing you know, people will be painting their houses purple and parking RVs in their driveways. This isn't about purple houses, Ted said quietly. It's about a child with a disability being able to enter her own home. Then they should have purchased a single-story house without steps, Diane retorted. Their poor planning isn't our emergency. The room fell silent again, this time with a palpable tension. Finally, Robert spoke. I motion that we comply with the department's requests and settle this matter before it escalates further. I second, Margaret added quickly. This is ridiculous, Diane sputtered. We haven't even discussed alternatives. All in favor? Ted asked, raising his own hand. 3 other hands joined his, leaving only Diane opposed. Fine, she snapped. But I want it on record that I object to this capitulation, and I'll be the one to inform Ms. Chen of the board's decision. As the board members filed out, Ted lingered. Diane, a word of advice? When you speak with Ms. Chen, remember that this isn't just policy for her, it's personal. Her daughter is directly affected by our decisions. Diane waved him off. She'd concede this battle because she had to, but she wouldn't forget how quickly her supposed allies had abandoned her. There were other ways to maintain standards in Oakwood Estates, and she wasn't finished with Melissa Chen yet. 6 months after the yellow ramp incident, Diane Holloway stood in the community park watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony for Oakwood Estates' new accessible playground. Children of various abilities played together on equipment designed for universal access, their laughter carrying across the autumn air. Emma Chen, now recovered from her surgery, but still using a wheelchair part-time, demonstrated the adaptive swing to a group of fascinated children. Her mother stood nearby, chatting with other parents, occasionally glancing proudly toward Emma. Quite a change from last spring, Ted Wilson commented, joining Diane on the sidelines. Diane nodded. The park committee did excellent work. They had an excellent chairperson, Ted replied pointedly. Diane allowed herself a small smile. After her confrontation with Melissa, she had thrown herself into researching inclusive community design with the same fervor she'd once applied to enforcing HOA violations. To everyone's surprise, perhaps most of all her own, she had volunteered to lead the initiative to make Oakwood Estates more accessible. We're being considered for that state recognition program, Diane said. The grant would cover the pool lift and pathway improvements. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd be excited about modifications to our community standards, Ted chuckled. Diane watched as Emma showed a younger child how to operate the wheelchair-accessible roundabout. Standards evolve, Ted. I was protecting the wrong things. The ceremony concluded with Melissa offering brief remarks, thanking the HOA board, and Diane specifically, for their partnership. When their eyes met across the crowd, Diane felt a moment of understanding pass between them. Not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. Later, as volunteers cleaned up after the event, Diane found herself alone with Melissa. Your daughter seems to be thriving, Diane observed. Melissa smiled. She is. Having spaces where she can participate fully makes all the difference. I owe you an apology, Diane said suddenly. Not just the official one from the board, a personal one. I was wrong. We all have our blind spots, Melissa replied. What matters is how we respond when they're pointed out. Diane hesitated, then asked, Did you know this would happen? When you moved here, did you plan to transform our community? Melissa considered the question. I chose this neighborhood because it was close to Emma's specialists and my new office. The transformation wasn't planned. She paused. But I won't pretend I'm not pleased with the outcome. The old Diane Holloway would have seen that as manipulative, Diane admitted. And the new one. Diane watched as the last children reluctantly left the playground, equal in their enjoyment, regardless of ability. The new one recognizes that sometimes it takes a disruption to see what's been missing all along. As they parted ways, Diane realized that her identity had been so wrapped up in maintaining appearances that she'd forgotten what communities were actually for, the people who lived in them, in all their messy, imperfect, diverse reality. She still valued order, still believed in standards, but now understood that the highest standard of all was creating a place where everyone belonged. Karen, as some neighbors had called her behind her back, had evolved. Not because she'd been defeated, but because she'd been shown a better way to win. The yellow ramp had long since been replaced with an elegant permanent solution that blended seamlessly with the Chen's home. But its brief, garish presence had changed Oakwood Estates and Diane Holloway forever. The bright yellow ramp stood out like a sore thumb against the muted beige of the Oakwood Estates homes, and Diane Holloway was determined to have it removed immediately. Standing on Melissa Chen's doorstep with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, Diane rapped her knuckles against the door with the practiced rhythm of someone who enjoyed delivering bad news. Absolutely not, Diane declared without preamble when Melissa opened the door. That ramp is a violation of HOA Code 5.2, which clearly states all exterior modifications must be approved by the committee and maintain the aesthetic standards of our community. Melissa glanced behind her, where her 12-year-old daughter Emma sat in her wheelchair, headphones on, oblivious to the confrontation brewing at their doorstep. They had moved in just 3 weeks ago, and the temporary ramp had been installed last week after Emma's surgery. Mrs. Holloway, I explained in my email that Emma needs the ramp temporarily while she recovers from her surgery. The permanent solution will match the house perfectly, but the contractor can't start for another month. Diane's eyes narrowed. Rules are rules, Ms. Chen. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased this home. The yellow is garish and visible from the main road. I've already received complaints. From whom? We've barely met any neighbors, Melissa replied, trying to remain calm. Emma needs access to our home. Surely there's some provision for. There are procedures to follow, Diane interrupted, flipping through her clipboard. You'll need to submit Form 23B for temporary medical accommodation, which will be reviewed at next month's meeting. In the meantime, that ramp needs to be removed by Friday, or you'll face a fine of $100 per day. Friday? That's ridiculous. My daughter will be trapped inside the house. Diane's gaze drifted to Emma for a moment, then returned to Melissa without a hint of sympathy. Perhaps you should have considered the HOA regulations before moving to Oakwood Estates. We maintain strict standards here, which is why our property values remain high. And that's more important than my daughter's ability to leave her home. Your personal circumstances aren't the HOA's concern, Diane replied with a tight smile. Everyone has problems, Ms. Chen. The difference is most people don't expect special treatment because of them. Melissa felt heat rising in her cheeks. This isn't special treatment. It's a basic accommodation for a child with a disability. It's a violation, Diane countered, handing Melissa a violation notice. Remove it by Friday or face the consequences. And please, when you do install the permanent solution, make sure it's submitted through proper channels for approval first. As Diane turned to leave, she called over her shoulder, "Oh, and welcome to Oakwood Estates. I'm sure once you adjust to our standards, you'll appreciate the quality of life they maintain." Melissa closed the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. This wasn't the fresh start she had hoped for after accepting the new position. She glanced at Emma, still absorbed in her tablet, and made a decision. Diane Holloway had no idea who she was dealing with. This wasn't Melissa's first battle with bureaucratic nonsense, and she hadn't become the Assistant Commissioner of Disability Services by backing down from a fight. Diane Holloway prided herself on running the tightest HOA in the county. What had begun as a volunteer position 6 years ago had evolved into her life's purpose. Her husband Richard often joked that she cared more about the precise height of lawn grass than their marriage, but Diane knew better. Order created value, and Diane was protecting everyone's investments. The day after confronting the Chen family about their garish yellow ramp, Diane sat at her kitchen table, organizing her next crusade. A stack of violation notices waited beside her computer. The Johnsons' unapproved bird feeder, the Patel's holiday lights left up 2 weeks past the acceptable period, and Mr. Garcia's trash cans visible from the street, a full 18 hours after collection. Her phone rang, displaying the HOA attorney's number. Strange, she thought. Their regular call wasn't scheduled until Friday. James, she answered. What can I do for you? Diane, we need to talk about a notice you issued yesterday to the Chen residence on Maple Drive. Diane straightened in her chair. Yes, the unapproved ramp. Bright yellow. Completely out of compliance. What about it? I've received a formal letter from the Department of Housing. You need to re-sign that notice immediately. Excuse me, on what grounds? James sighed. The Americans with Disabilities Act and Fair Housing Act both supersede HOA regulations when it comes to reasonable accommodations. The ramp is temporary and medically necessary. But there are procedures. Diane, James interrupted, his voice uncharacteristically stern. Ms. Chen is the newly appointed Assistant Commissioner of Disability Services for the state. She knows exactly what her rights are, and frankly, your approach has put the entire HOA at risk of a discrimination lawsuit. The blood drained from Diane's face. Assistant Commissioner, she never mentioned. Why would she need to? Her daughter's disability and right to access their home isn't contingent on her position. Diane's mind raced. No wonder Ms. Chen had seemed so confident. I was just following our protocols, James. Your protocols are in violation of federal law in this case, and Ms. Chen has requested all previous accommodation requests and actions taken by the HOA for the past 5 years. She's opening an investigation into our practices. She can't do that. Actually, she can. It's literally her job. James paused. Diane, this could get very messy. I'm advising you to not only resign the notice, but to issue a formal apology. Apologize? I was enforcing the rules everyone agreed to. Rules that don't supersede federal law. Fix this, Diane, before the entire board gets dragged into a discrimination lawsuit that will cost us far more than a yellow ramp. After hanging up, Diane sat frozen at her kitchen table. All her years building her reputation in the community could be undone. She'd been so focused on the color of the ramp that she'd missed the bigger picture. But apologizing felt like admitting defeat, and Diane Holloway didn't lose, especially not to newcomers who hadn't earned their place in Oakwood Estates. She pulled up the HOA database and began searching for any mention of accessibility requests. Perhaps this wasn't the first time they'd made this mistake. She needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with before making her next move.